Well, hello, beautiful family, and welcome to this part 20 in this many parts journey that we have titled The Journey. And today we are in chapter 20 of the book Patriarchs and Prophets, and chapter 20 is titled Joseph in Egypt. And I'm excited for this particular chapter. Joseph's story is one of the most famous stories in the Bible, and it's also the one that people are most familiarized with because it's one of the most famous. But along the journey, when one reads this chapter and reads the Bible together, as we should, one realizes, of course, that there's a lot going on in the background that the Bible is not entirely explicit on. So I'm excited for this chapter. Let's go ahead and get started. Again, chapter 20, Joseph in Egypt. Last time we discussed Jacob's return to Canaan and how he settled things that happened with his family, then Joseph, and how he was showing more affection towards Joseph, and the brothers got jealous. And eventually we ended up the chapter when the brothers sell Joseph to passing caravan of people heading to Egypt, which they took slaves. Joseph's brothers sold Joseph as a slave, and now this is where this chapter picks up. As Joseph, you gotta put yourself in Joseph's shoes here. Joseph went from being the loved child to being a castaway, to being a slave, being treated as such. So being from a lot of affection to zero affection at all, there was obviously a mental struggle, reason for depression, reason for feeling lonely and whatnot. And of course, the enemy takes advantage of when we are at our lowest to try to take us away from our roots. But here's one of the first lessons that we learn from this chapter, and it's the importance of education. As Joseph is going away towards Egypt, away from his father's land, he could look out and see the mountains where he knew were close to where his father was. So he could see his home at a distance, and he was walking away. There was only one thing that came to his mind, and was the stories that Jacob had told him about his previous life, about the mistake that he had done in life, and about how God, despite those mistakes, guided Jacob's life to the point where he was. Jacob, of course, disclosed the promises that God had made to him and how God had, kept true to them. So Joseph now, as he was walking away, he decides, okay, I don't have my family, but I have God. I have the God of my father, who in the past, of course, was kind and merciful to my father, and I'm going to honor and serve him. So a very important key piece of information here, our education, how we raise our children, what we tell them to, what we educate them in, is of huge importance in the grand scheme of life, because it is at the hard moments that those seeds of gospel that we put in their minds that God takes them to fruition. So it was here, then and there, that Joseph decided he was going to honor God in everything. And of course, everything meant everything, every aspect of his life. So it's not very specific as to what exactly came to Joseph's mind, but it's definitely evident that everything that Jacob knew about God, he had told to Joseph and shared that information. So now Joseph arrives in Egypt, and of course he's an outsider in Egypt. He doesn't know anything there, but there's something that history has taught us severely. Egypt was a deeply religious, nation, and not religious of Christian religion or God religion of their own gods and their own idols and whatnot. So you can only imagine the amount of pressure that Joseph had living in the land of idolatry, and he was the only one in there worshiping God. And then you have all these people that have prospered, that have lands. Egypt was a very wealthy and powerful nation back then. We can even call it the center of civilization at some point. So he sees, the fruition of these people that praise idols, and he's serving God and he's a slave. So you can only imagine the temptation that came through his mind, or the thoughts of, is God real? Is God the true God and whatnot? So Joseph get hired into Potiphar's house, and Potiphar, was a high-ranked officer in the palace of Egypt. And needless to say, we all know the story. Joseph was faithful in everything. He was humble, he was honest, he was diligent, he was efficient. So Potiphar's house, things started getting more prosperous under Joseph's care. So everything just went well for them. His wealth was growing. He trusted everything to Joseph, Potiphar, because of how well, Joseph has served. Joseph was young, he was a young man, strong man. Being a slave, one would imagine that he carried a lot of heavy stuff here and there, and did a lot of daily chores. So you can imagine him a bit muscly and very good looking. So this is the time where not the first, but definitely a huge temptation came to Joseph. Potiphar's wife liked Joseph and wanted to have, intimacy with Joseph. And so she approaches Joseph and, proposes that they, do awful things in secret. And Joseph, of course, he remembers that he must honor God above all. So what happened here, you gotta put yourself in Joseph's shoes. He had two choices. Either I being Joseph, either he serves God and potentially loses his life because he's basically rejecting a direct command of Potiphar's wife, and she could, she had power over him. She could reject that and potentially lose his life, or he could do it and not lose his life, but then dishonor God. And at this point in time, Joseph chose, as we all know, to honor God. He decided that his life was not worth more than honoring God, and he goes away. Of course, Potiphar's wife gets upset. She lies that, Joseph tried to take advantage of her. Potiphar comes, and here's something that is not quite explicit in the Bible, but Ellen White writes about it. If Potiphar had believed for a second that Joseph had indeed done what the wife was accusing him of, he would have been killed. But Joseph had such a high integrity, such a high standard to life, that Potiphar did not believe his own wife over Joseph. So this tells you a lot about the character that Joseph displayed during his time under Potiphar's house. But of course, Potiphar didn't want to kill Joseph. He did not believe his wife, but he had to maintain the honor of his house. So he casts away Joseph, and Joseph goes to prison. And the obvious question is, oh my God, why would, God allow this? Joseph was faithful. He was, dutiful. He was efficient. He was a perfect example of what one that served God should be doing. And yet here is Joseph, even lower than he was before, not a slave, but a prisoner. And so he goes to the prison. And of course, I imagine that again, temptations flooded into not believing, into distrusting God, whatnot, but he chose once again to honor God. And in prison, he was as efficient, as faithful, as honest as he was during Potiphar's house. And throughout the years, he eventually became a trusted person in prison. So he became sort of like the leader in the prison, in charge of, the prisoners. So once again, God starts, putting things back into his trust. And one has to realize, we probably all know how the story ends, but God was definitely, it was not evident at the moment, but God had been preparing Joseph time and time again for what was coming. Eventually, the baker and the cupbearer of Pharaoh go into prison, and they both had dreams. Joseph was the leader of the prison, so they were under his care, and they had dreams that were deeply affecting them. And Joseph knew, he realized they were troubled by that. So he asked them to share their dreams. They do share their dreams, and Joseph, with the help of God, of course, he interprets the dream for them. In a few days, exactly what Joseph has said would happen, God said will happen through Joseph, happened. And the cupbearer goes back to Pharaoh's house, and Joseph asks him, please, remember me when you go back. I'm here. I don't deserve to be here, whatnot. But of course, humanity kicked in, and the cupbearer was thankful for the favor, but then forgot about Joseph and moved on. Some time passed in between this, and then Pharaoh had a dream, and the dream deeply disturbed him, and the cupbearer realizes, oh wow, Joseph had interpreted my dream, and Pharaoh was having trouble having the people of his land, his idol worshippers, to interpret the dream for him. So the cupbearer recommends Pharaoh to take Joseph out of prison and bring him in. Joseph is taken out of prison. He comes into Pharaoh's presence, and Pharaoh asks him, can you interpret this dream for me? And this is another lesson in this chapter. The words that came out of Joseph's mouth were, I cannot interpret this dream for you, but God can. So once again, you can see the humbleness of Joseph. He was not fast and quick to speak. He realized that everything he could do was really because God had provided him the ability to do. So he once again gives the glory to God above everything else. And of course, Joseph interprets the dream to Pharaoh, which had to do with 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine. And at this point, Pharaoh realizes that there's no man in the kingdom that is qualified to do the job that needed to be done for Egypt to stay alive during those 7 years of famine that were about to start in 7 years. And he appoints Joseph. And all these pieces of the story come together here. It was hard to understand, of course, throughout the life of Joseph, why things were going from bad to worse and from bad to worse. But eventually it all paid off, and God put him as the head. He was second only to Pharaoh. So the only one above him was Pharaoh. The entire land of Egypt was under the care of Joseph. And this says a lot about our life as Christians. The Bible does not say we will not have afflictions while on this earth. Matter of fact, the Bible says that we will have afflictions as Christians, as believers, but we need to be faithful even on the smallest of things. Ellen White says here in the chapter that one needs to act in life understanding that God is watching every second, every minute of it. Everything that we do or don't do, as minute as it seems, is being recorded in the books of heaven. Whether you take some money out for a homeless person, whether you tell a famous white lie or whatnot, if you're gossiping behind someone's back, all those things that seem harmful to you is being recorded in heaven. And Joseph was fully aware of this, and in everything he did, no matter how small the task, he put God above, God in front of it. And of course, for him, it paid off. This is not to say that if you're faithful to God, you will one day be president of the United States, or you will be a very wealthy CEO of a company. That's not really how this works. Of course, in the case of Joseph, there was an ulterior plan above all of this for God, and it was to preserve his own people. You gotta remember that the famine also affected Jacob, and that's what we're gonna be talking about in the next chapter. So I don't want to go too much into it to not, spoiler, to not throw a spoiler alert. But needless to say, it's not about the reward that we could or could not get because we're honoring God. It's about developing a character and a lifestyle that everything we do, day and night, is to honor God. And like that, God promises that He will mold and shape our characters, and we'll be able to resist temptation and, of course, be more and more, bit by bit, like our beautiful teacher and master and God, Jesus. That's for this chapter. Once again, go ahead and read the book. Read the book alongside of me. This is an impressive book right here. But don't forget to study the Bible with it. Thank you for joining, and until next one.